meeting to order. And for the first hour today, we have the representatives here from TSB. Thank you very much for being here. And with that, I'll turn it over. I'm sure you have some opening comments. So.
Yes, thank you, Mr. Chairman. Honourable members, I want to thank you for inviting the Transportation Safety Board of Canada to appear here today. I bring with me 3 colleagues who offer a wealth of experience. Mr. Jean Laporte is our Chief Operating Officer. He's been with us since our inception in 1990 and possesses a deep understanding of the mandate and the processes we follow. Kathy Fox has been a member of the board since 2007. She has over 4 decades of aviation experience and is an expert in safety management systems. Mr. Kirby Jang is our Director for Rail and Pipeline Investigations. He's well placed to provide greater context and information on TSB rail investigations, as well as the statistics we hold and why we hold them. We are here today because you're conducting a review of the transportation of dangerous goods in Canada and the role of safety management systems. A number of high-profile accidents here and south of the border have shone a spotlight on rail safety and the transportation of crude oil. They have forced us to re-examine whether our operations are safe enough, and if not, what needs to be done to improve matters. Because today there is a heightened fear. There has been, and there is no other way to put this, an erosion of public trust. 5 years ago, the amount of oil moved by rail across Canada filled 500 cars, maybe 5 or 6 long trains. But last year, that figure rose to 160,000, and it is projected to go higher in the coming years. And Canadians know much of this oil is volatile. No accident speaks more profoundly to the risks than Lac Mégantic, where last July a train carrying crude oil derailed and caught fire, killing 47 people. In this investigation, we still have months ahead of us, months in which we will complete our investigation and report to Canadians. That being said, early on in this investigation, we identified important safety issues and communicated them to regulators. And then in late January, an unprecedented move. The NTSB and the TSB made parallel recommendations aimed at making the transportation of crude oil safer across North America. In Canada, we called for tougher standards for Class 111 tank cars. That's because in Lac Mégantic, the entire train was made up of older, unprotected tank cars. And almost every car was breached, fueling the fire. I want to show you an animation. This car was in the middle of the train, and you can see how very badly damaged it was. As you can see from this photo, even the cars at the end of the train, which are the cars on the right of the photo, these are the cars that were moving relatively slowly when they derailed. Even those cars were very badly damaged, and that has taught us something. Today, the rail industry is moving toward a new standard for general service Class 111 tank cars, and that's a good thing. But a long and gradual phase-out of older model cars simply isn't good enough. It leaves too much risk in the system. That's why we were crystal clear. Commodities posing significant risk must be shipped in containers that are safe. And the sooner, the better. Our second recommendation dealt with the way railways plan their transportation, how they choose the routes on which oil and other dangerous goods are carried, and how they ensure train operations over those routes will be safe. This involves a comprehensive, system-wide review of many variables. It's about looking at what lies ahead along each route, identifying alternative routes, and choosing the ones with the least risk. It means, for example, ensuring the track is maintained to the highest standard, that speeds are appropriate, and that wayside detection systems are in all the right places. This needs to be followed up with risk assessments to ensure the steps being taken will keep our communities safe. Our final recommendation to emerge early from the Lac-Mégantic investigation was about making sure when something does go wrong, even in the face of advanced planning, the right resources are in place to reduce the severity and impact of a spill. We therefore called for emergency response assistance plans where large volumes of liquid hydrocarbons, like oil, are being shipped. An answer to our recommendations is due later this month. We are encouraged by the Minister's response to our early communications on Lac-Mégantic. They signal an understanding of the risks of carrying more and more oil by rail, of what is at stake, and of the need to address the risks the TSB finds. In responding to our recommendations, it is my hope the Minister will lead with initiatives to squarely deal with these three important safety issues. And now I'd like to discuss one of the other ways of ensuring our transportation network is as safe as it can be. And that's the second topic you have been tasked with addressing: safety management systems, or SMS. As my colleague Kathy Fox so aptly put it, safety management systems help companies find trouble before trouble finds them. An SMS is not a panacea, let's be clear, nor should it be mistaken for one, but it is a very good tool, one that helps find the biggest risks so mitigating steps can be taken. At the Transportation Safety Board, we think SMS is so important that we put it on our inaugural safety watch list back in 2010. And to be fair, Canada's major railways and a number of short lines have been working to implement SMS, and they've taken significant steps. But 12 years later, many of the systems they've implemented are not yet mature. That means they are not netting all the safety benefits they should. I'm talking about the need for audits and for strong regulatory oversight. I'm talking about risk-based inspections and, where appropriate, enforcement to ensure compliance. The Auditor General's report reaffirms the importance of all these things, and we strongly agree. Before I close, I would like to note that we've recently updated our own regulations, modernizing reporting requirements and harmonizing thresholds for dangerous goods with the TDG regulations. That will mean more notification about trains that go off the rails. For example, all 1- and 2-wheel derailments must now be reported to the TSB. It will also mean that when a release of dangerous goods leads to consequences such as death, injury, collision, derailment, fire or explosion, or any other threat to the safety of Canadians, railways must report these spills, no matter how small. So that's where we are today. None of the safety issues are about to disappear anytime soon. And this committee has an enormous task ahead, not just to examine the issues of SMS and the transportation of dangerous goods, not just to hold hearings and find out ways to ensure that our railways, our waterways, our pipelines, and our skies are as safe as they can be, but also to make recommendations that will lead to real action, concrete measures to shore up and restore shaken public confidence. In all of this, we at the TSB share your goal. Advancement of transportation safety is our mandate. We've spent more than 2 decades working at it. And you will find us committed, informed, dedicated, and very cooperative. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thanks very much, Ms. Tadrose. And that picture that you have up there, pictures sometimes don't always tell the whole story, but I'll tell you, after being there last summer, it brings back It was a terrible tragedy, a terrible mess. So thanks very much for your opening comments. And with that, Mr. Mai, 7 minutes.
Merci, Monsieur le Président. Merci aux témoins de...
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I'd like to thank the witnesses for having come in, especially for the work that you do with respect to the TSB. We know that all the recommendations you make are very important for us. In closing, you said that we needed action. I'd also like to know from your perspective, how long has the TSB known about the .111 problems? When did the TSB first hear about problems with respect to those cars?
We first flagged issues with those cars about 20 years ago. They started to come up in our investigations, and we made a couple of very specific points on them. But as time went on, we learned more and more, and I would say that this accident gave us the opportunity to learn the very most, because the whole train was Class 111 tank cars. And so we were able to study each and every tank car to see how it performed and how it failed in the accident. So that's why we came out with a very firm recommendation on the 23rd of January.
Et d'ailleurs, j'apprécie et je vous remercie beaucoup pour vos recommandations.
Thank you for your recommendations. And with respect to the .111 cars, especially the older ones, you said that they must be withdrawn from service. So it's a gradual phase out. We still don't have deadlines at this time. What the government is saying is that we have to work with the United States, with our neighbors to the south. Do you think it's possible, or would you recommend, that at least when trains are going through populated areas, especially heavily populated areas like downtown cores, for example, should those older .111 cars be prevented from circulating through densely populated areas? Would that be a recommendation while waiting for a deadline from the government?
Possible from a system point of view. When you look at what is carried across Canada and the routes that those products have to travel over, I'm not sure that it is possible to avoid every urban area. We would rather see a more systemic approach that would have those older cars phased out, so that the cars that do go through all of our communities will be safer.
Et est-ce que vous... Parce que là...
Now, I know that the minister said that 10 years, as proposed by the U.S., is too long of a time frame. We know that CN has said, for example, that their deadline was about 4 years. Irving Oil Company said that they'll do so within 1 year. So can you come up with a specific recommendation in terms of timelines? Or are you going to allow the government to go forward with their own timeline?
The sooner the better, and the longer those cars are out there, the longer the risk is in the system. But it is a very complex situation, and you're quite correct when you say that there has to be coordination with the Americans, because this traffic is going back and forth across the border all the time. So you can't say, well, these cars are American and these cars are Canadian. You can't do that. So what we have said is to the regulators, this is your job. You work this out and you come up with a time frame that will get those cars out of service. The sooner, the better.
Et lorsque vous dites que vous avez déjà discuté avec la...
And when you say that you've already discussed it with the Department of Transportation with respect to your own recommendations to formulate a plan, did the government let you know whether or not they do have a specific plan in terms of timelines? Are you aware of any such plan?
TSB recommendations is that the minister has 90 days in which to respond to our recommendations. So that 90-day period is up on the 23rd of April. So we will be watching very carefully to see what the response is.
Parfait. Comme recommandation aussi, à la suite...
As a recommendation following the Lac Mégantic tragedy, you said that the Department of Transportation should require transportation plans when large quantity of such products are being moved. Doesn't that already exist? Don't they already have emergency preparedness plans? So if so, what are the gaps and what recommendations would you have? Are there gaps and are there gaps on the government side?
Emergency response assistance plans required for some commodities, but they are not required right now for crude oil. So this is what we are saying, is that you need to take that model and extend it to crude oil.
Est-ce que le BST a soulevé justement des...
Has the TSB raised concerns? Because we know that Transport Canada has recently undertaken studies to review how crude will be classified, for example. So has the TSB already talked about the fact that the crude oil is now more dangerous given all the additives it contains, and if so, how long ago?
Issue of the properties of the crude oil in the Lac-Mégantic tank cars in September, and then the government moved forward with requirements for testing and proper classification of those goods.
Et juste pour revenir aussi au niveau de...
Just to come back to the SMSs that you mentioned, do you believe for municipalities to be able to prepare and act, should they not first of all be well informed about the products that are being moved across their territory in order to be able to react or prevent any kind of serious accident?
Between the municipalities, the provinces, and Transport Canada, we are more concerned that there be emergency plans in place and that there be the right materials there and the right resources in the event that there is a catastrophe.
Okay, thanks very much. We'll now move to Mr. McGinney for 7 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Good morning, everyone. Thank you for coming. If I could ask quickly, the Lac-Mégantic investigation. Does the Transportation Safety Board have all the financial resources it needs to complete this work?
Absolutely. So the way things work at the TSB, we normally operate within our budget, the budget that we're given, but if there are extraordinary circumstances, we can go to Treasury Board and request further funds. We can make a submission. So we did that in the case of this investigation, and those funds were approved.
Okay.
So just to say, I mean, this investigation obviously is one of our top priorities.
Second question would be, based on the notes you've distributed and you spoke from, Ms. Tadros, and it deals with the SMSs. You say that the SMS is a very good tool, helps to mitigate steps in advance. Then you go on to say that you have serious problems with respect to the way in which the SMSs are overseen by the regulator, by Transport Canada. You talk about the need for audits, for strong regulatory oversight. You cite the Auditor General's report. So I think for a lot of Canadians, they get it. They understand that there's a partnership between the regulator, the government, and the railway companies. But how far are you willing to go? What else are we supposed to do here in this committee to strengthen regulatory oversight? What can you offer up here for our advice?
I'm going to ask Kathy Fox to address that because this is absolutely her area of expertise.
Thank you. Safety management systems are extremely important to a transportation mode, an organization, in order to help identify and manage their risks. That being said, they don't take away the need for very strong oversight, and that oversight can vary from strict inspections to confirm compliance to verifying, auditing the effectiveness of their processes. And the two work hand in hand. SMS certainly shouldn't be a substitute for regulation or a substitute for oversight.
Can you give this committee and Canadians, say, 2 practical ideas or 3 practical ideas of how we would strengthen this SMS private sector and regulator relationship and interface? What 2 or 3 things should we be doing?
Well, the first thing is to really look at how companies have implemented SMS. Unfortunately, some companies may see it as a manual and not a pervasive process that has to take place throughout the company, that has people with a constant mindset of looking for things that can go wrong. And I think first the regulator has to look at how companies have implemented SMS and not just look at whether they have a process in place, but if that process is effective.
Can I switch gears and go to another issue, which is the question of third-party liability? Since the accident in Lac-Mégantic, a lot of Canadians have been asking questions about who is responsible, who ought to have known, who is responsible for the cleanup, and we really have no idea. I think, to our knowledge, we have no real idea what the long-term costs of this are going to be. We have no idea, for example, what the ecological and environmental costs will be of the damage in the waterways that have been affected, for example. Many Canadians have written to me asking this committee to look at third-party liability and have gone as far as to say that liability has to be shared now and bringing into the tent those who are importing, those who own the dangerous goods. So, for example, if an oil refinery is importing diluted bitumen, or in this case, Bakken crude, and there's a problem, and there's a major accident, then liability should be shared not only between the federal government, the provincial government, the railways, but also the owner of the crude in that tanker. Have you looked at this issue?
No, we haven't looked at it, and we won't be looking at it because it's a matter outside our mandate. So it's very clear in the legislation that we operate under that the board does not assign blame or liability. So we leave that to other systems. We leave it to the CTA, we leave it to the courts, we leave it to policymakers within government, and we focus solely on safety issues.
Well, I guess I'm not asking the Transportation Safety Board to assign blame. I'm asking whether the Transportation Safety Board has examined the question of liability in the context of improving safety. If liability were shared more directly with the owners of the dangerous goods that cause a problem, would that have a bearing, for example, on having the owner of that property, those materials, asking much more difficult, much more probative questions of the shippers, paying much closer attention to how that material is being transported? Would that not increase safety?
It would have to be clearly demonstrated that there was a strong link to the safety issues in a particular investigation before we would go down that road.
Is that something you're looking at now in Lac-Mégantic?
Well, it's an ongoing investigation, so at this point we're still looking at everything, and I can't speak to the particulars in that investigation.
Can I turn to the, you've talked about advanced, we talked about the ERAPs, the Emergency Response Assistance Plans. And I want to ask, when the government announced with the Federation of Canadian Municipalities that they had arrived at an agreement around disclosure, many people were astonished, frankly, that the decision that was made was that railways were going to be compelled to disclose 90 days after the fact what they had transported through a municipality. Many Canadians on the ground were saying, councillors, mayors, citizens were saying, well, why aren't we actually asking them to disclose 90 days in advance what's coming through our municipality so we can be better prepared, so our first responders can know, so all of these other issues that you've raised can be addressed. Why? Have you said anything about this, or were you involved in this, or can you help us understand why it's after the fact and not before?
We were not involved in that, and I think that that's an issue of public policy between the citizens, the municipalities, and the government and the railways. Where we do get involved is when there is a safety issue. So there's a safety issue in terms of first responders. They absolutely have to know what they're going to be dealing with. And they absolutely have to have the right resources in place if there is a major accident. So that is the thrust of our third recommendation, calling for emergency response assistance plans.
Okay, thank you. Now move to Mr. Watson, 7 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Ms. Tadros, thank you to you and your dedicated team. We appreciate that you are here as we undertake what is an important investigation of our own, if you will, into how we can improve safety management systems in the transportation of dangerous goods regime. I want to thank you and your team for the work that you do, and especially your work into the what is a difficult and ongoing investigation into the tragic accident at Lac Mégantic. Let me just start from the beginning, if I might ask. When, obviously, we don't have a final report yet. Is there any expected horizon or timeline when we might see a final report? And would it include is it likely to include additional recommendations than those that have been coming out so far?
Well, I'm always reluctant to give a date because as soon as you give a date, it's not going to hold true. But this investigation is one of our highest priorities. We have a dedicated team on it. They are working on this and on nothing else. We are in the third phase of 3 phases of an investigation, which is the analysis and writing of a draft report. Following that, we have certain procedures that we absolutely must follow because they're in our Act. And that includes circulating a draft and receiving comments. We also have a huge number of laboratory reports that have been completed on this investigation. So I think you can understand it's a huge task, but we are working to bring it to the Canadian public as soon as we possibly can.
Very good. I appreciate that, and I appreciate the thoroughness with which you're tackling this particular issue. I want to move to the issue of containment, if you will. With respect to Lac Mégantic, you had a train that was going downhill, I believe at a considerable speed prior to the derailment. Does anybody know how fast they would have been going before they...
The people at our lab, the engineers, did an analysis of that, and the speed depends on exactly which car you're talking about and at exactly which point. But do you recall the average at the beginning?
65 miles an hour was in that range.
65 miles an hour in that range was the top speed. But as I said earlier, those cars at the end were traveling much more slowly. And except for the last one there, you see that they are every bit as badly damaged as the ones that were traveling fast. So we don't think, and I have seen things in the press that have written off the notion, well, nothing would have withstood that kind of speed.
I asked that question actually. Is there a container that could have survived that? And if so, what features would it contain? Because that would obviously point us to a standard, if you will.
Okay, well, I can't tell you what would have withstood it, but I can tell you that if you have strengthened tank cars, that they will hold up much better. And if you look at the new proposals coming out of the Association of American Railroads, those are strengthened requirements.
I'd like to clarify your position with respect to the DOT 111 standards. We understand there are essentially 2 classes of them. We had National Steel Car who was here talking the difference between what they called legacy cars and good faith cars. Your recommendation in terms of phasing out the DOT 111s, does that relate to the exclusively to the older standard of DOT 111s or to the newer standard of DOT 111s as well? I'm trying to understand where your recommendation actually gets to.
Well, what we're saying to the Minister of Transport is these cars need to be as tough as they can be. So we know that the older cars, the cars in Lac Mégantic, are not strong enough. They do not withstand collisions and derailments, and we've seen this for more than 20 years. We've seen it here, and we've seen it in accidents in the States. There was a standard put out in 2011, and that standard is stronger than the standard for these older cars. However, we have seen cars that are built to that 2011 standard that are not withstanding derailments either. In particular, they have half head shields, and so we also see damage sometimes to the top of the head of the car. And so we said to the minister, take a look at this new standard that's being proposed by the AAR.
Okay. I appreciate that, because the question of phasing out points to where do we phase to, right? If we don't have a new standard, so clearly if the old DOT 111s are inadequate entirely, the newer DOT 111s have deficiencies, then we have to arrive with especially with our American partners, at what a new standard would be, so we have a comprehensive solution where to point the phase out. Once that's in place, I think we can then predict more accurately what the phase out period will look like. Okay,
Yes,
I appreciate that. Emergency response action plans, very important component, obviously, of the transportation of dangerous goods regime. As we know, and I think in large measure because of your efforts to point us in the direction, we are looking at plugging gaps with respect to crude oil. An advisory committee has reported already to the minister, and officials are reviewing their recommendations on an expedited basis. So we'll be hearing something about that in the near future. And the question I have for you is, and I don't know whether TSB has a position on this or whether they're agnostic on it, but would you prefer to see separate emergency response action plans developed for classes of oil based on ignition potential or flash point? Like, should Bakken oil be treated differently than, say, Alberta crude that's been thinned with dilbit? Do you guys have a position on that?
I mean, I would say generally that you want the emergency response plan to be geared to the risk of the product. But whether you want to divide oil as to which type of oil, that's a policy decision. Do you have any views on that? Mr. Jang is going to...
Okay.
Certainly in terms of ERAPs, they are based on risk assessments. We do know the properties of petroleum, crude oil, and liquid hydrocarbons also have variations in it. Obviously, the ERAPs are approved by the regulator. Our expectation would be that those risks would be looked into, and it's a good point whether they're separate or perhaps encompassed within the same ERAP, with possibly the idea that we're looking at the same types of resources, the expertise required, whether it's, for example, the packing group 2, packing group 1, or packing group 3 risks involved.
Okay. Thank you, Mr. Braid. 7 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you very much, Ms. Tadros and your team for being here today and for the important work that you're doing on behalf of Canadians. Ms. Tadros, in your opening statement, you mentioned that the second recommendation of the TSB deals with the way railways plan their transportation. You go on to say that this involves a comprehensive system-wide review of many variables. I just wanted to ask if you could elaborate a little bit on that, on what those variables are and the complexity of this particular recommendation.
Okay, there's really 3 elements to this recommendation, and the first is route planning. So you take a look at your route and you choose the safest route over which to carry those dangerous goods. If there's only one route, then you move to the second, which is an examination of train operations, to make sure that the operations on that route, whether it's the chosen route or it's the only available route, have the highest safety standards. So we would be looking to the railways to look at things like trackside testing, speeds, ensuring that the equipment is of the highest standard. Things like that to make sure that they're playing the A game really on those routes. Then what we've asked them to do is not to make it static. So you don't just put this in place and then move goods over that route for the next 20 years. We want them to follow up with risk assessments on an ongoing basis to make sure that those control measures that they've put in place are working. Because you can have an accident with the same consequences as Lac Megantic that is caused by something totally different. So what you need to do is bring down the risk in the whole system that there are going to be accidents, derailments, for instance. You want to bring down that whole risk.
To what extent are railway companies doing this now on their own?
Some railway companies, particularly Canadian National, well, there are some requirements in the United States which is called OT 55. So if a Canadian railway, large Canadian railways operate in the United States all the time, for those operations they have to comply with the requirements. Canadian National has said they are going to bring those requirements north of the border and implement them in Canada. But we're asking them to go a little bit further than OT 55. In terms of the concept, I think we've received positive feedback.
Thank you. I want to move on and ask you about safety management systems, SMS. Again, in your opening statement, you indicate that Canada's major railways and a number of short-line railways have been working to implement SMS, and they've taken significant steps. Then you go on to say that, but 12 years on, many of the systems they've implemented are not yet mature. Why is that?
Madam Fox?
As I started to indicate earlier, some companies may, and I'm not talking necessarily about any one company, but just in general, some organizations may take a very bureaucratic approach to safety management systems, assuming that this is just a manual. Whereas in true safety management, the best principles of safety management really boils down to having processes in place that identify hazards, having very good internal incident reporting systems and follow-up on incidents before they lead to accidents, and having a positive safety culture in the company. And some organizations, maybe partly a result of the infrastructure to support it, of the internal knowledge within the company, of whatever their priorities are, may not be moving as far along the continuum as they could be or should be, or we would like to see this far in.
Generally speaking, though, do you agree that the introduction of the SMS system some years ago and the continued evolution of that system is an important pillar of rail safety in Canada?
Absolutely. And we'll never know the accidents we didn't have because of safety management systems. So sometimes it's hard to measure the effect over a short period of time. But over a longer period of time, we would expect to see the risk in the system to go down, and that should translate in fewer accidents or less serious accidents.
And in your various reviews and investigations, you must come across some SMS systems that are best examples or models of best practices. Has that been the case? And how would you suggest that we further build out this important pillar of rail safety in Canada?
We haven't done a cross-modal comparison or cross-company comparison of safety management systems. Certainly in each of our investigations we look at how companies are managing safety, and we identify areas of risk.
Thank you. And finally, as I understand correctly, the Transportation Safety Board has something called a watch list. Could you explain what that is and what's on it and how that evolves?
Well, this was something that we began a number of years ago to bring attention to the issues that we felt were most important, the safety issues. So on the watch list right now are the 9 most important safety issues in the transportation system. And Mr. Jang has a copy of the pamphlet. So if you're interested in the rail issues only or in all of the issues?
The rail issues primarily.
Okay, so we have onboard video and voice recorders, following signal indications and passenger trains colliding with vehicles in our fast train corridor, high-speed corridor. So the first two of those issues are squarely coming out of our Burlington investigation, and they are both outstanding recommendations. The third, we see an awful lot of collisions in the high-speed corridor at rail crossings, so that's why that's on the list. So these really are the issues where we've verified and done an awful lot of analysis to determine that they are the most important issues, and they're the issues that we really want to see action on.
Okay, thank you. Now we'll move to Mr. Sullivan, 5 minutes.
Thank you, and I want to thank you for your excellent presentation at the very beginning, because it got us a very succinct analysis of where we're at today. I want to talk about risk analysis by the railroads themselves. In the U.S., rail carriers must analyze risk. Do they need to do the same thing in Canada, or is it only in the U.S. that they do that?
This is part of a safety management system, so I'll let Madam Fox speak to that. She has a great deal of experience, particularly in the aviation industry, in terms of safety management systems, but the principles are the same.
Well, I would just say that there's a need for ongoing risk analysis of ongoing day-to-day operations, and there's certainly a need when operations change. For example, changes in the carriage of dangerous goods should trigger an SMS-type risk analysis. Changes in routes, changes in going from primarily, say, transporting goods on the prairies to transporting goods in the mountains. Any type of operational change or significant should trigger a risk assessment.
So are you aware, do the railroads report these risk analyses to the government or to Transport Canada or the Transportation Safety Board, or are they just left with their own devices?
Transport Canada would audit the safety management system of railway companies. Because they're the regulator, the only way that we would get involved in this is in an ongoing investigation. If we want to look at how the safety management system operated, then we would look at that in the context of that particular company and that accident.
So you're not aware then whether or not any of the carriers in Canada have undertaken a new risk analysis based on the 400-fold increase in the transportation of diluted crude oil, for example?
I'm not aware, no.
Okay. Because as I read the U.S. National Transportation Board safety recommendation dated January 23rd, and yours is similar, rail carriers must annually analyze the safety and security risks for transportation routes to include 27 risk factors, such as the volume, track type, class, maintenance schedule, curvature, environmentally sensitive or significant areas, population density along the route, emergency response capability, areas of high consequence along the route. They must identify alternative routes over which it has authority to operate and perform a safety and security risk assessment of those routes for comparison. And then the FRA analyzes those risk analyses and determines whether or not they meet, they need to be revised, whether they are, in fact, they are the safest opportunities. And we don't do that in Canada, do we?
Well, I can't tell you that we don't do it in Canada because I'm not aware of what every single railway is doing in terms of their risk analysis. We're calling for the same thing in our second recommendation. However, there would be nothing to stop a railway company from doing that kind of analysis within their safety management system.
So in terms of what we've heard from people in the public about why don't they move the trains around major population centers, that would be part of the risk analysis to whether or not it's too expensive, whether or not it's possible, whether it's not it's practicable. I know in the U.S. they do legislatively prohibit the transportation of dangerous goods, for example, around the city of Washington, D.C. We don't do the same thing in Canada, do we?
I'm not aware that that we're doing that, but you have to look at it from a logistics point of view. So these railways were built throughout Canada, and cities grew up along the railways. They grew up there because that's where their industries are. So if you look, for instance, at you want to route everything around the city of Montreal, but the goods are going to the port in Montreal. So you're going to end up with a rail line, I don't know, way north or way south of Montreal, and then how are you going to get the goods in? You're going to have to truck them in. So I think, you know, that sometimes easy solutions are not the way to go. You have to look at the network, you have to look at the realities on the ground, and bring the risks down within the system that's there.
In terms of the .111 specifically, since 1991, we've known they're not safe for the transportation of dangerous goods, and yet we've continued to use them for the transportation of dangerous goods. When the Mississauga train derailment happened in 1979, the reaction from the regulator was to lower the speed to 15 miles an hour until it was determined that it was safe. In other words, until there were enough inspection points along the route to give a reasonable assumption that it was safe. The transportation of dangerous goods in .111s is now widely known not to be safe, and since we cannot stop them, can we at least slow them down? Is there a possibility that a 15-mile-an-hour regulation could be placed on .111s through densely populated areas?
Well, part of the route analysis is looking at the speed, so that's one of the risk factors. So certainly that's something that they should be looking at, but what was the speed of the last trains there? Do you remember? We're looking at those. I'm just asking Mr. Jang about the last cars there. So the cars that you see that are very badly damaged, the ones that have derailed, the analysis has shown they were going about 20 miles. Did you say miles? Yeah, 20 miles an hour. So they were going very slowly. So the problem is with these tank cars, and they do not perform well in a derailment or a collision, even at lower speeds.
Okay, thank you very much. Ms. Young, 5 minutes.
Thank you very much for being here today. And I note that in the range of questions that were already asked, there seems to be a gap between what the standards say, what the train companies are doing, and then what's being implemented. Would you agree with that comment?
Oh, the devil's in the detail. So I would think it would depend on exactly which fact situation you're talking about. There certainly, and we have pointed out, is some room for improvement in the standards for the tank cars, for the operations, for the emergency response.
For example, there's SMS, there's ERAP, but it doesn't appear that there's a consistent way of ensuring that the SMS is followed or the ERAP is monitored or filed with somebody or somewhere where it's consistently upgraded or looked at or implemented. Would you say that that's correct?
We haven't looked at the ERAPs for other products, but they are required to be filed and approved by Transport Canada. In terms of the SMS, you're talking about the auditing of the SMS, and that is something that the Auditor General has dealt with in his report. Do you have anything to add on that?
So, because I guess what I'm struggling with is we're hearing from you that we know a lot more today, obviously, than before, which is fantastic. We have these systems in place. But having said that, we've also heard from others to say that, well, these things aren't followed up with, or that's not exactly done on a regular basis, and et cetera. So who looks after, best practices to ensure that those safety mechanisms actually are consistently followed and in place?
Well, it is primarily the responsibility of the individual companies, the railways. So that is their responsibility. And the regulator provides regulatory oversight. So they do audits for SMS, they do inspections on the ground. and those two are intended to complement one another.
Do you think that in the report that you've tabled and in your ongoing investigation, then that there will be sufficient measures put into place to ensure that these gaps or these oversights no longer happen?
In this investigation and in almost all of the investigations we do, one of the elements that we look at is regulatory oversight. So those will be issues that we will be examining.
So, for example, is a rail company now in, are we assured, the public, that the SMS are being followed to its highest standard?
Kathy, if you look at the Auditor General. Well, again, the Auditor General has done an extensive review of the implementation of safety management systems and Transport Canada's oversight of SMS in railways. What I'd like to add is that there are certain basic principles that every safety management system must have. And they are specified in different ways, slightly different ways, depending on the mode of transportation. So air is a little bit different from rail, is a little bit different from marine, but they're all based on the same principles. And I think what we've seen in our investigations is it isn't always easy to foresee the combination of circumstances that can lead to an accident, because there's always more than one, as we saw in the release of our report on the first air accident last week. So it has to mature over time as people gain experience, but that's why it's very important to have effective oversight.
Now, we have actually heard, as a committee, from, for example, AIR, but what I found interesting today in hearing from rail is that there doesn't seem to be the stringent sort of reporting of, with AIR, every single incident must be reported. What I've read here is that with rail, that's not the case, but we're moving towards that. Is that correct?
Mr. Laporte can answer that question. Because
the standards for rail are just as stringent as in aviation or marine or pipeline. In our regulations, there are 10 criteria, and if any one of those 10 criteria applies, then there's an obligation to report the incident, the accident, or whatever the case might be. But most of the time what we find is there's a multiple of those criteria that apply to a particular situation. Pretty well all the occurrences are reported. We have in the rail mode over 1,000 occurrences that were reported in the past year. And that figure is actually increased from the previous year. There's a 4% increase in the number of reported occurrences in railways in 2013 compared to 2012.
Okay, your time has expired, Mr. Mai.
Merci, Monsieur le Président.
Thank you, Chair. With respect to the Lac-Mégantic tragedy, we know that there was one conductor and 2 companies were exempted across Canada and authorized by the Department of Transportation. And so MMA was one of those who were allowed to run trains with a single conductor. Do you have any recommendations in that regard?
looking at in this ongoing investigation from a safety perspective.
D'accord. Concernant les...
Thank you. And with respect to positive train control or automatic braking systems that could stop the train, in 2012 the TSB had recommendations to that effect. We know it's considered to be the ultimate integrated braking system. It has been implemented in the U.S., but Transport Canada has not yet imposed any regulations or requirements. Do you have any recommendations for the Minister, and do you know why this has not been applied here in Canada?
Positive train control was required by Congress, so a number of railways on a number of lines in the United States are moving towards that. I understand it's quite a challenge in terms of technology and in terms of money. When we came to look at the situation in Canada following the Burlington accident, we decided there are a number of systems out there, and we're not going to be prescriptive and say that it has to be PTC. So we've outlined the safety problem and said there could be a number of ways that you get to that result, that you fix that safety problem. So this is a matter that I believe has been sent to an advisory committee, and we're hoping that there will be some positive movement on it.
Ben justement, c'est parce qu'on fait le commentaire.
Well, precisely. We're making the comment, we're hearing comments about DOT 111 that we need integrated systems like in the U.S. In this case, when we're talking about automatic braking systems, could you confirm that the United States are further ahead than Canada in terms of implementing such safety measures?
In the United States,
Peut-être rapidement, parce que j'ai plus beaucoup de temps.
Just quickly, since I don't have much time left, you mentioned the Auditor General's report, who sharply criticized Transport Canada and the lack of resources that Transport Canada has in order to follow up problematic cases. Could you please quickly comment on what the Auditor General's subjects upon which you agree?
I'll have to go high level since there isn't a lot of time, but basically I think even though the Auditor General found problems with the way that Transport Canada was overseeing safety management systems in transportation, that if you read that report carefully, the Auditor General is strongly endorsing the notion and the principle of a safety management system.
About 3 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you to our panel this morning. It's been very, very enlightening. I just wanted to touch very quickly on it's been brought up a couple times regarding the two-man crews and the implementation of that. My understanding is the new directives that came out of your initial assessment of the Lac-Mégantic incident, that the directive that came out of that was a permanent move to the usage of two-man crews. Is that also your understanding? With respect to transportation of dangerous
goods, would have
goods,
to go back and have a look
directive?
and see if there was a time period on that. But yes, it was put in place very quickly, but whether it will continue ad infinitum, I can't speak to that.
Okay. Yeah, it is my understanding that it is a permanent...
Only to the transportation of dangerous goods.
Yeah.
Doesn't apply to all trains.
Correct. That's correct. So but it is a very important issue that has been addressed in a fairly timely fashion based on initial recommendations. So it's good to see that. I just wanted to touch a little bit on, there was one issue on here, sorry. Your look at the system-wide review of many variables you talk about in dealing with your recommendations on the transportation of dangerous goods and how they're carried by railways. And I just was hoping you could just give us, you gave one quick example of that, the maintenance of the highest standards of the tracks and speeds are appropriate. How do you see the whole network aspect of it? You do talk about that, the system-wide review of all the variables in the complete network. How do you see that being brought forward through this recommendation that you've brought up on the risk assessments? How do we ensure that these steps are being followed?
Well, there's two ways of doing it. You can have the railways file their plans with Transport Canada and have Transport Canada review them, or you can, they can do it on an audit basis and go out and choose based on the highest risk and audit those sections. So there's a couple of different options that would be open to the regulator.
And it was interesting to note also in your presentation the changes that we've seen. I mean, you know, you talked about 5 years ago, 500 cars moving oil and 160,000 in the last year, and we've seen such a change in that. And yet, you also talked today about the challenges we also face in the fact that many of our, whether they're small centers or large centers, have grown up around the tracks and actually have moved in around the tracks to a large degree. You know, the communities have actually moved closer to the tracks rather than further away.
Yes.
How do we, again, you know, that's all part of that whole situation of how how do we come up with regulations on that take into account those different factors? So we have a lot more dangerous goods being moved as we see growth and expansion, and yet we also see growth towards the railways themselves. How are we going to be able to deal with this going forward? Have you given any thought to that at this point in time, or are there any recommendations that you'd be bringing forward on that?
Well, I think that really was the thrust of the 3 recommendations we made in January. So the first one, get those Class 111 tank cars out of there as soon as possible so they're not running through our communities. The second is route planning and analysis and following up with risk assessment, so you ensure that the operations over those routes where dangerous goods are being carried are the safest possible. And the third is to make sure you have the resources in place if there is an accident, so that you can contain the damage and the risk.
Okay, thank you. We never have enough time, but we've come to the end of the session. I want to thank all of you for being here today, and we have some more witnesses coming forth, so if we could change, we're going to suspend for about 2 minutes. Thanks again. We'd have the members take their chairs, please. Okay, we'll resume the second half of our meeting today. I'd like to welcome Mr. Jeans and Mr. Gardner. Thanks for being here, gentlemen. And with no further ado, we'll turn it over to Mr. Jeans. 10 minutes or less, please.
Thank you, Chair. Transport Action Canada is a national volunteer-based organization and a registered charity. We were created back in 1976 in response to an invitation from the government for public participation in planning the future of transcontinental rail travel, and at that time we were known as Transport 2000. We later extended our area of interest to all public transportation modes, intercity bus, ferries, urban transit, and we have had a long-standing interest in transportation safety and are frequently called on by the media for comment on safety matters. We have affiliate organizations across Canada. One of our affiliates, TRAN, organizes the annual colloquium on railway safety in Quebec City, which I attended last week along with many industry and government experts. We also have a strong involvement with airline passenger safety. This dates back to the Swissair Flight 111 crash in 1998, when with other groups we founded an air passenger safety group that continues to consult with Transport Canada on an ongoing basis on air safety matters. We do believe that statistically air and rail, which are generally federally regulated transportation modes, are very safe. However, accidents, particularly those with multiple fatalities, dangerous goods spills, or major fires, do attract considerable media attention and raise public concern. We note that highway rail collisions or pedestrian accidents at rail crossings or on railway lines are actually a very small number when compared to the accident statistics for the highway mode. Nevertheless, we believe that rail crossing safety should be a continuing major concern of the federal government, and particularly here in Ottawa, where in September of last year we had 6 passenger fatalities on a double-decker transitway bus, an accident that should have been avoidable, and hopefully we'll find out precisely why that accident happened before too long. We are strongly supportive of the expertise and independence of the Transportation Safety Board, and particularly about their openness about ongoing investigations. But we understand the importance of not trying to second-guess the reasons for an accident before their investigations are complete. We note the items that have already been discussed today on the TSB watch list, and one that we feel particularly strongly about is the need for positive train control. Ms. Tadros mentioned to you the progress that's being made because of legislative action in the United States, and certainly in many other parts of the world, positive train control is the standard rather than something to think about sometime in the future. The TSB has been recommending it strongly, particularly since the Via Rail accident at Saint-Charles-de-Bellechasse, Quebec in February of 2010, and the Burlington accident in 2012. I will say as an aside on positive train control that I personally was involved in Ottawa with the planning of our O-Train here, which is the only federally regulated railway that does operate with positive train control. The O-Train has one-man operation. There is a German-based system which ensures that the train cannot exceed allowable speeds at stations or cannot pass signals that are at stop. And that technology has permitted that system to achieve a complete absence of fatalities or injuries among passengers over its more than 12 years of operation, today carrying over 14,000 passengers a day. It would be good if that kind of technology had been extended to other railways in Canada. We're also concerned very much about the issue of misinterpretation of rail signals, which was mentioned also by Ms. Tadros. Modern signal indications, particularly on high-speed lines, such as in Burlington, are purely visual. There is no backup, and they're very complex for the train crews to interpret and react to correctly. And in this context, the recommendations from the TSB regarding video and audio monitoring of locomotive engineers in the cab, as well as the monitoring of what is in front of the train, which involves cameras looking forward, is very important. We participated in a number of railway safety events. The Railway Safety Act Review Panel we submitted to, which reported back in 2007. We've appeared before the House of Commons before this committee on air safety, before the Senate committee on the amendments to the Railway Safety Act, where we supported strongly the introduction of safety management systems. We spoke at a conference in May last year of the System Safety Society of Canada on system safety in rail transportation. Attended the Canadian Transportation Research Forum seminar in January of this year on rail safety and transporting dangerous goods in Canada, and as I mentioned also the TRAC conference in Quebec City last week. Looking at another recommendation of the TSB which relates to alternate routes for dangerous goods transport, we have a strong concern right now about the abandonment of historical main railway lines, which is putting our national rail system at risk. For example, when Canadian Pacific sold their line that used to operate through northern Maine to St. John, New Brunswick, this essentially reduced our rail network to a single route east of Quebec City, which totally disrupted train transport between the Port of Halifax and central Canada when a major derailment occurred in Montmagny a few years ago. Last year, the last 2 years, we've seen abandonment of both the historic transcontinental railway lines in the Ottawa Valley, leaving only trackage through the Greater Toronto area to connect eastern and western Canada with no alternate routes that avoid that populated area. And this year, we're about to see the abandonment of the historic intercolonial railway segment in New Brunswick between Newcastle and Bathurst, which will leave only one railway route into New Brunswick. So we think that's an area that the federal government should be and Parliament should be concerned about. Looking back at passenger transportation safety, which is our main concern, obviously since the disastrous Hinton crash in 1986 when 23 people died, we've had a very good record with Via Rail. Via has actually only had 3 passenger fatalities in accidents since then, 2 at Coteau, Quebec in 1992 and 1 at Biggar, Saskatchewan in 1997. It has, of course, had accidents causing the deaths of train crews, the tragic loss of 3 lives in Burlington in 2012 and 2 engineers in Thamesville, Ontario in 1999. But essentially, travel by train in Canada is extremely safe. With respect to technology investment, the railways must continue to investigate in technology as well as in their processes for safety management systems. An example of the failure to do that was the Toronto subway accident in 1995, where 40-year-old automatic train stop technology failed to operate correctly and there were 3 fatalities. That, of course, was not a federally regulated rail system, but it's still an example of what happens when you fail to go with the latest technology. In fact, in other countries which do have modern technology for automatic train control, there have still been serious accidents where there were gaps or flaws in this system. The 2 most serious accidents in Britain, Ladbroke Grove in 1999 with 31 deaths when 2 trains collided head-on because of a failure to observe signals and a failure to use the existing positive train control on that system, and also an earlier accident in 1988 with 35 deaths, again involving a failure of an outdated signaling system. And in Spain, the crash at Santiago de Compostela with a high number of fatalities last year, which was a result of a bad design interface on completely new track between 2 different and incompatible signaling systems. So investment in technology is important. So wrapping up, again, Transport Action supported the safety management systems to the Railway Safety Act. We did express in the past and some concern about the resources of short-line railways, particularly to afford the implementation of these measures, though the major railways clearly have been making the appropriate investments in introducing that safety culture. And so the Lac-Mégantic accident may, in fact, show a failure of the application of SMS, but we await the TSB report on that. And I will point out that those concerns, particularly about the ability of smaller companies to implement SMS, were previously raised by Mr. Justice Virgil Mashansky, who led the inquiry into the Dryden Air Ontario crash in 1989. obviously long before this, but Mr. Justice Mushansky has expressed concerns to the Railway Safety Act Review Panel back in 2007 and more recently about whether this safety regime can be effectively implemented everywhere. I think those are my main points, and I'd be happy to answer any questions.
Okay, you were right on time, Mr. James. Thank you very much. Mr. Gardner, 10 minutes or less, please.
I'll try to do the same. So, good morning, everybody. In a perfect world, I would make my presentation in English, but the problem is my English is only good after the first hour, and I don't think we're going to be here after an hour, so allow me to do it in French, please. Alors, bonjour donc à tous.
So good morning, everyone. I was invited to appear. I wasn't told why, but I will be insightful. And since I am a specialist in civil liability for insurance and assessment of damages, I suppose that I'm here to talk about compensation rather than prevention. Security has been discussed a great deal already this morning, and prevention is extremely important. It must be done. But we will never be able to reduce the risk to zero in terms of railway safety, any more than we can do so for air transportation or highway accidents. So after Lac Mégantic, we should think about a compensation system that is better than the one we currently have. The proof will be painfully obvious for the 47 people who died. The compensation process is going to take over a decade to untangle, and the result is going to be extremely discouraging. I even predict that the damages offered to victims by the end of this process will probably be nullified, since there is an inadequate insurance coverage. But let us pose it a fundamental law. Adequate insurance coverage is not the answer, is not the panacea. You can have the best coverage. Let's replace MMA by CN or CP, who have 1.1 billion or 1.5 billion dollars in coverage according to the type of catastrophe. You would still have the same problem. The problem is one of responsibility, liability. Insurance is there to ensure liability and responsibility. So what needs to change, and what has not been done yet in terms of railway transportation, are the liability rules. Railway transportation is the last major system which has not been renovated in terms of compensation rules. It has been done for air transportation, it's been done, of course, for road transportation, which is more provincial jurisdiction, as well as in maritime transportation. Railway transportation required such a tragedy as Lac Mégantic to awaken people to this reality, and nothing has been done so far. What I propose, and I prepared an abstract with my own, with a home done translation, so I apologize in advance for any translation errors, but I think there are simple solutions that are possible. All kinds of solutions are possible. We could introduce, as has been done in some Australian states, an automatic compensation system for railway transportation victims. This could be done at the infrastructure, like at the infrastructure level, but I think we need to be as pragmatic and efficient as possible. Given the current structures, it is possible to renovate compensation systems for the victims of railway accidents in a fairly simple way, by basing our approach on rules that have been in place since 2003 for air transportation. When I say it's easy to implement, I can tell you that the same transportation board supervises air and railway transportation, and in the same way we could have the same entity supervising compensation for both. Now, there was a Montreal Convention that was signed in 1999, which was went into effect in 2003. Over 100 countries have signed this convention, including the U.S. and Canada, of course. And this convention has a two-phase liability system, so it could easily apply in the railway to the railway sector. So, as we're talking about an international convention, we're not going to talk about dollars. We're going to talk about DTS, special rights. Now, in the convention, there's a first level of compensation, which is set at 100,000 DTS, which corresponds to 175,000 Canadian dollars today. Naturally, that will vary according to currency rates. Now, for this first level of compensation, the haulier's liability is automatic. The only way the air carrier can avoid paying, or rather having his insurer pay, is to prove that the victim is at fault. So if you transpose this to the railway context, for example, if a person was trespassing on the railway, in which case the carrier could say, no, this person was intruding on private property or trespassing on private property, and therefore responsible for his or her own injury or death. Now, so unless the victim is at fault, this is practically an automatic level of compensation. Beyond that first level of compensation, of automatic compensation, the haulier's responsibility or liability can always be triggered, except that they have more ways to exonerate themselves for that level. Of course, they can still invoke the victim being at fault, but they can also invoke their own lack of responsibility or wrongdoing, saying that they took all reasonable measures in order to avoid that accident, or that the accident was caused by a third party. So it is therefore the carrier is presumed no longer responsible but at fault. In that case, the compensation will be paid out without any ceiling. The Montreal Convention has abolished the existing thresholds, or maximums rather. No more maximum amounts have been exist. So, but the carrier has more means to exonerate themselves. Now, this is all this can absolutely be transferred to the railway sector. All you have to do is separate cases of physical injury and deaths from property damage. Now, the problem is all of this is covered under the same liability insurance, property damage and physical damage to people. Now, I think the slogan, people come first, that really should be people come before property, and I really think this is how we should be thinking when we're applying compensation rules for such accidents. Obviously, we've got environmental damages too, and it's great that we can rebuild damaged buildings or destroyed buildings, but I really think we should compensate people for their physical harm that was done to them first and foremost. Now, this is an insurance regime that needs to be dedicated for personal injury or death, and I think that victims should not find themselves with absolutely nothing, but we really need to focus attention first and above all on victims themselves. In the terrible example of Lac Mégantic, and when this will have been resolved, and let's dream in Technicolor and imagine that money is found and that all the victims are compensated 15 years from now, it will be too late. Orphans will have grown up. Other people will have moved on to other things. People need the money now. You all know the English proverb, justice delayed is justice denied. It is so applicable in the case of personal injury and cases of death that the system must absolutely be changed to ensure that we're focusing attention first and foremost on people and then on things afterwards. If we do that, we will realize, ladies and gentlemen, that not only is it feasible, but this is what actually costs the least. It is terrible to say, but in the case of a disaster like that of Lac Mégantic, in terms of damages, the largest damages are those caused to the environment, which will probably go beyond $2 billion, and then damages to vehicles, to buildings that were located in downtown Lac Mégantic, and finally, they assess compensation for the 47 victims who died in the accident and their families. You know, I'm a specialist of physical harm, and I do physical injuries. I don't know what the physical injuries were of those 47 people, but I can tell you that if those 47 victims were completely compensated, if the way things are done before ordinary courts, if we were to compensate the families of those 47 victims, it would be less than $25 million. It would probably be less than $20 million. That's just a drop in the ocean of the costs that will follow from such an accident. So that's what I want to emphasize, the economic feasibility of changing this system. It's quite easy to do, in fact. The proof is in the pudding. On the air side of things, things are working very well with this approach. Insurance costs are predictable and fixed, and insurance companies know what they're dealing with. Since, unfortunately, as we say, the human life has no price, but it does have a cost before the law. I thank you.
Mr. Sullivan for 7 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Janes. Mr. Gardner. Mr. Gardner, I'm going to leave my colleague to ask questions of you. I'm going to focus on Mr. Janes. The reason we're here, I guess, is Lac-Mégantic, but in general, the transportation of dangerous goods. You mentioned the abandonment by the railroads of a couple of what I would have thought key routes that didn't go through the City of Toronto up the Ottawa Valley. And these were done after the beginning of the wave of the transportation of crude oil. And so I wonder if you know, you probably don't, whether the railway companies actually used profit as the only driving method for determining whether or not to abandon those lines, or whether they took safety into account in analyzing the risk of whether or not to transport more dangerous goods through Toronto as a result of abandoning those lines.
Well, the Canadian Pacific line up the Ottawa Valley avoided major population centres because it passed south of Ottawa through Smith Falls. Of course, many towns are on the railways. Many of the towns owe their existence to the railways, as did the town of Lac-Mégantic. So one cannot avoid population centres altogether. But the concern that we have is that there is such a concentration in such very narrow corridors. If you go east of Toronto, the only railway lines connecting east and west within Canada pass a few hundred yards apart through the city of Port Hope. And there are no other east-west routes connecting eastern and western Canada. The derailment, which I mentioned, a very serious one, which destroyed a bridge over the Rivière du Sud in Montmagny, completely severed the only container route that was available to Canadian National between the Port of Halifax and the rest of Canada. So this is partly to do with the effectiveness of our system, as well as the safety of the communities. We've known about the dangers of transporting dangerous goods since the Mississauga derailment in the 1980s, and as was discussed earlier, there have been measures, mainly lower speeds and more automation in terms of monitoring the correct performance of wheels, axles, etc. on the trains. But we just think that the abandonment of railway tracks in Canada for economic reasons should be counterbalanced with a government concern for the integrity of our national rail network, so that we do have the kind of options that the Transportation Safety Board is looking for.
And those, and thus far, this government and the government before it has been relatively silent on the whole notion of maintaining an integral structure.
And the New Brunswick and federal governments are being almost completely silent right now on the abandonment of the intercolonial railway between Bathurst and Newcastle, New Brunswick, which is severing the Via Rail's passenger route from Montreal to Halifax, and is taking away an alternate freight route into New Brunswick should the main freight line through Edmundston become unavailable, as it did during the recent major CN derailment on that line.
In terms of the Transportation Safety Board's recommendations in the past, and we expect there will be some in the future, and there were some on January 23rd, with regard to the Burlington crash, which is the most recent of the Via Rail, there were 3 very specific and very detailed recommendations. 1, positive train control. 2, that video recorders be installed on trains. And 3, that the cab of the train be structurally sound enough to protect its occupants in the event of a derailment. To this date, this government has not yet adopted any of those measures in any forceful way. Via Rail has said they will voluntarily comply, but ought there to be some kind of force by Transportation Safety Board on this government to actually impose these new regulations?
Well, we think there should be. The example of the United States was that Congress took that responsibility by enacting legislation that there would be positive train control. Now, there are some logistical problems in when it will actually be completely rolled out, but the railways are investing heavily there already because they have to. And in the rest of the world, those kinds of investment have already been made. Positive train control actually in the United States goes back to the 1920s in terms of when it was first introduced. And yet in Canada, with the single exception that I mentioned of a passenger railway, the O-Train in Ottawa, we don't have it on any of our federally regulated rail lines that carry passenger traffic. So yes, federal government action is required there, and we're moving much too slowly, and the wait-and-see attitude to see how it works in the United States after the railways there have made these investments, including Canadian-owned railways, CN and CP, are making those investments in the U.S. portions of their network. I think that's something that the government must do.
Those investments will cross the border. As those locomotives cross the border, so will the positive train control on the locomotive itself,
but it has no value if it isn't also implemented by the wayside systems along the track.
Exactly.
And that is an expensive component which must be addressed, and whether it has to be addressed with solely private money. The railways are the only mode that have to pay for all their own infrastructure. So to solve this problem, it may not be something that can just be left to the railways and their own investment programs. I think the government must be involved, particularly because of how far we lag behind progress in the rest of the world.
One of the things the Transportation Safety Board in the analysis of the Burlington crash was that it was a missed signal, so it's human error, and a missed signal is missed hundreds of times each day. In Canada, it's only a handful of them that result in a collision.
Yeah, I don't think it's hundreds of times.
Hundreds of times a year. Sorry, hundreds of times a year.
Hundreds of times a year, but I think perhaps once a day. Now, many of those incidents are occurring at very low speeds in rail yards and so on. But it's not only driver inattention. The interpretation of those signals is extremely complex. There are many, many different color light indications. The color and position of the lights is all you have to go on. There's no readout in the locomotive cab that tells you what the signal means, unlike railways in most other parts of the world. And there's no backup should the crew, for whatever reason, and we will never know the reason for the Burlington crash because we don't know exactly what was happening in that cab, hence the recommendation for cameras and audio recording. The third recommendation on protection of the actual driver's cab, that was a tragic way that accident unfolded, with the way that the locomotive collided with a concrete building beside the track. So that particular thing, while important, we don't view as being nearly as important as addressing the need for positive train control.
Okay, thank you. Mr. McGinney, 7 minutes.
Merci, Monsieur le Président. Professor Gardner.
Thank you, Chair. Mr. Gardner, I'd like to come back to what you have proposed. If I correctly understood you, you said people before things, and you have proposed a new compensation approach for victims following an accident. But today we're mainly dealing in this study with the issue of improving railway safety before accidents in order to prevent those accidents. So although I understand what you're proposing today in terms of compensation, today I would like to go back not to ex post facto, but beforehand, before a major accident can take place, like the tragedy that took place in Lac Mégantic. In Canada, railway companies must transport all products that are presented to them, including dangerous goods. CN and CP apparently each have $1 billion in civil liability. What do you think of the idea that owners of dangerous goods should also have to share the liability for the transportation of their goods. For example, in the case of Lac Mégantic, Irving owned the goods. And from what I understand, Irving has absolutely nothing to do with what's going on in the aftermath, which is to say Irving is not the one who's writing the checks for cleaning up Lac Mégantic. They are not the ones responsible for compensating locals. They are not the ones paying the bills for environmental cleanup. What do you think of the idea that the time has come to bring into the tent, so to speak, the owners of these goods? Well, I may surprise you, but this already exists in Quebec. It's existed in Quebec since 1978, in fact. It's not recent. Since 1978, the Environmental Quality Act stipulates that any owner of a contaminant, and there's a whole list of contaminants in the Act, including the oil the crude that was being transported through Lac Mégantic. So the owner of such contaminants, even if they are not in the care and control of the contaminant at the time of the accident, remains responsible for cleanup costs, etc. And in fact, an order was issued by the Minister of the Environment, which you're telling me that Irving owned the crude at the time of the tragedy on July 6th. Now, I don't know exactly what's going on in the class action suit, but that seems to be disputed. Was it World Fuel, the initial owner, who owned it until it arrived in St. John, New Brunswick, in the port in St. John, New Brunswick? So there seems to be a dispute about who actually owned the crude. So that type of compensation does exist, or the possibility does, but only for environmental damages. Anything to do with compensating victims, like a class action suit, cannot apply. So, is it feasible? Certainly. Does the provision used in the order, will that be contested by the owners all the way to the Supreme Court? No doubt. Will it withstand a constitutional challenge? We'll see. What about other prosecutions of the same type? But the fact remains, we still won't know anything for at least 10 years. So I don't know if that exists in other provinces, but what you're saying exists in Quebec and has existed in Quebec since 1978. Following Lac Mégantic, is Quebec rethinking the fact that liability begins and ends with environmental issues? Well, as you know, the railway sector is generally regulated by the federal government. So in any case, the provincial government, including the Quebec government, can't say much about the matter. Now, the automobile insurance provisions exclude TRAN just because of jurisdictional issues, whereas in other states, for example, Australia, who has a federation that resembles ours, in Australia, not only are car accidents covered through automatic compensation regimes, but also train accidents. So it's a jurisdictional issue in our case. Now, Quebec, I suppose, could do it for internal areas over which they do have jurisdiction, but the problem is, along these lines, so the problem or the advantage, depending on the case, of course, or your perspective on these things, are very little populated along those lines. So this is where we may have more conflicts between physical damage to a person or to property. So you're saying that it is feasible for the federal government to completely review the issue of liability and share that liability with the owner or the deemed owner, whoever decides who the final owner is? Well, it depends how you view these things. First of all, you could make only the carrier responsible or liable, but of course transportation rates, because everyone is going to be subject to that mandatory insurance, well, obviously that would affect transportation rates according to how dangerous the product is. Now, that's one solution. One potential solution. Now, the carrier could also be made directly responsible, but finally, and of course it's always the insurer who's going to compensate, there could be another special clause dealing with the owner of the dangerous good, and in that case they would have to share the liability with the carrier. No matter what the approach that is chosen is, logically one could make the owner of dangerous goods more liable as compared to owners of grain or chickens or whatever the case may be, as used to be done for railway transportation. Now, in terms of implementing a new regime, in saying, let's say that the owners do pay part of the insurance rates or accepts part of the liability. What remains to what is important is that the victims don't get caught up in these disputes about who owns what and who is responsible for what. There should be an automatic compensation.
Sorry, I didn't mean to cut the interpreters off. My apologies. Mr. Watson.
I appreciate that. I'm actually writing down what the interpreters were just saying, because that latter point was an important one about victims should if I understood correctly, victims should be compensated apart from the question of shared liability between the carrier and a third party. That was the point you were making at the end.
Yep.
Okay. Let me thank, of course, our witnesses for appearing here today. We appreciate your contributions. Obviously, we are undertaking, at the Minister's request, an important study into how we make improvements both to safety management systems, but the regime around the transportation of dangerous goods as well. On issues of liability, I know we're looking more at what we're doing. We're improving liability regimes for the marine sector, for example, with a major panel report that has already come due, and their recommendations are under investigation or are under consideration, review, if you will, on an expedited fashion by the government and our officials. So I suspect we'll be hearing more about the crude oil regime particularly. There's an additional element where we're looking at our preparedness now for hazardous materials by the marine mode of transport as well. So these are very timely. Our work here at the committee and your contributions, obviously, Mr. Gardner, on the issue of liability are important to this committee. Just a quick question, Mr. Gardner, about the Canadian Transportation Agency's consultation, the railway third-party liability insurance coverage regulations. Have you contributed or made a submission or contribution to that particular effort by the CTA?
J'ai appris la semaine dernière qu'il y avait eu une...
Last week, I learned that there had been a consultation since, well, first of all, I teach and I travel quite a lot all over the world. I was in France to discuss the issue of railway accidents at the beginning of the month. Next May, I will be in Spain to discuss the tragedy that took place in Saint-Jean-de-Compostelle. And unfortunately, I hadn't heard about, or rather not until yesterday, that there had been a request to file, and the deadline was March 21st, so I'm late, and it's just because I wasn't informed, and so it seems that things don't get all the way into rural Quebec.
We appreciate that. I just wanted to know whether you were aware of it or had a chance to do that. Your submission here obviously is important. It's on the public record, and it's important for consideration as well. If you wish as well to table for the benefit of this this committee, any type of written submission as well, that would be appreciated. If you want to formalize some of your thoughts or put together a more comprehensive submission to the committee, we'd welcome that for sure. That could also be distributed, I presume, as well. I could take a copy of that to the minister relative to the other process. Mr. Jeans, thank you. You've been before our committee before. I've been on this committee since 2007, so we value that you and your organization continue to stay actively engaged and active with respect to appearing before this committee. I just want to, I don't want to sound like I'm picayune, if you will, on this, but I do want some clarity on a particular point, and that relates to a positive train control. Ms. Tadros was here earlier, and I think what I heard in her response is that the TSB's recommendation was not specific to positive train control, but to fail-safe mechanisms for braking. That implies that there are other aspects or other ways of achieving you know, a fail-safe than positive train control. But I'm I'm hearing both the NDP continue to raise this, that it was a recommendation for PTC, and I think I've heard the same, Mr. Jeans. For clarity's sake, there are other mechanisms to achieve fail-safe other than PTC. Is that correct?
The problem is that PTC, depending on where you are in the world, it really is a generic term and has different meanings. There are very specific implementations of different kinds of positive train control. The Japanese bullet trains, the Shinkansen, have had complete automated train control in the cab, not dependent on signals beside the railway line since 1964 when those trains started running. And as I mentioned, even American steam railways back in the 1920s, the Pennsylvania Railroad, for example, had mechanisms for positive train control, as did the Great Western Railway and other railways in the United Kingdom. So the technology has many forms and has evolved in many ways. You have situations like in Santiago de Compostela in Spain, where there was an older system interfacing to a more modern system, and the interface itself between the two systems was part of the cause of that accident. But the situation in Canada is that we only have the visual indications and the two engineers in the cab as the way of checking that. In the case of Burlington, that didn't work. There was a third qualified engineer in the cab, although in training he was a qualified and experienced engineer, and that still did not prevent the misinterpretation of the signals there. So when I say positive train control, I mean a system that provides the second line of defense so that if there is a mistake made or if a signal malfunctions, as it did at Saint-Charles-de-Bellechasse, when the Via Rail train derailed, the signal was partly obscured, that there will be a second line of defense, and that is the recommendation of the TSB.
Okay, I appreciate that. I only draw the distinction because Ms. Tadros drew the distinction herself, Mr. Jeans. If there are varying models, which one are you recommending that Transport Canada implement here? Is it what they're doing in the United States? Is it a different model? For greater clarity, when you're talking about positive train control and making the recommendation, what model are you asking us to consider?
Well, I think because we have a fully integrated rail network between Canada and the United States, and because both Canadian railways operate extensive track in the U.S., and because they're equipping their locomotives to meet the American standards, I think we have to observe that integration. What's done in Europe is useful. The German technology I mentioned in Ducy is used on Ottawa's O-Train, the only federal railway that uses it, but it's also used on light rail systems such as Calgary and Edmonton to provide safety. But we can't go and buy off the shelf a European system because it would not work across the interface between Canada and the U.S.
Okay, thank you very much. And I'll move to Mr. Tote, 7 minutes. I know you were.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Mr. Jeans, I also wanted to touch a little bit on the positive train control aspect of things. There does seem to be a little bit of misunderstanding on exactly what is happening in the United States today on this particular issue also. Are you aware that currently, even actually right now in the United States, there is a bill that has been introduced to extend the full implementation of positive train control?
Yes. Now, this is an administrative issue because the railways have indicated back to the government that they cannot meet the original deadline of 2015, which was mandated by congressional legislation. So, yes, it's still an open question as to when. What is not an open question is whether it is going to happen. It is happening, and the railways are investing heavily. The only question is by when will it be converted, and obviously that's still a matter for discussion. But in Canada, there is not yet any program.
However, in the U.S., one of the challenges they're facing with their 2015 deadline is because the technology is not really there yet 100%, and they're still working through that process. There also is the estimate from the Federal Railroad Administration that PTC would prevent perhaps 2% of collisions and derailment, and it's going to cost over $10 billion to do the implementation. And that money is also being diverted from other safety measures that there is a belief out there also that would actually create more effect than the 2%. But because of the railways investing so heavily into PTC right now, there is a challenge there as to directing their funds in the right direction. Not to say that, you know, there's an issue with PTC and that it's not something that should be looked at seriously, but I think it is important that we are recognizing these factors in this going forward, and that there is a reality that you know, that legislative requirement has put a real burden on the railways and has diverted some of their other safety measures that they may be able to implement, haven't been able to implement because of the money that they're actually directing so strongly into this particular piece of legislation. So I think it's just good and important that we're, you know, recognizing those type of things. The other thing I wanted to ask you about is in regards to safety management systems. I know you touched on it briefly in your introductory remarks that you were supportive of safety management systems, and I'm glad to hear that. I just wanted you to comment really on your perception of the addition of SMS to the safety regime for Canadian rails and the effect that has had. Have you, you know, maybe you can comment on your perception of the effect that that has had on the safety regime in Canada.
Well, I think the important thing is that it's established that the railways have to have their own safety culture. They have to have responsibility for safety at the highest management levels. It isn't something that is just responding to problems identified by government investigators, but it is part of the operating culture. It is something that requires continuous investment by the railways. I mentioned already that the railways have to invest in their own infrastructure because governments, unlike other modes, don't pay for railway infrastructure in general, with the exception, of course, of infrastructure improvements for Via Rail, which is a Crown corporation and therefore which depends on government investment for its infrastructure improvements. But generally. What we have seen, and it's certainly been evidenced by the presentations that I've heard at the number of events that I've attended. I mentioned the Canadian Transportation Research Forum meeting earlier this year, where we had a number of presentations from the mainline railways, the short-line railways, and the supply industry. The same thing with the System Safety Society meeting, which I attended and presented at last year, and the TRAN conference. The railways are all extremely conscious of the importance of safety, and I think it is the introduction of SMS that has brought this elevated consciousness. The question is one really related to the resources of the smaller companies, and can companies like MMA and like Megantic afford to properly implement the safety regime that is required? We don't know yet, because we haven't had the final report from the TSB, to what extent the safety management culture within MMA may or may not have been deficient. We're waiting to hear that.
Yeah. I would submit that they cannot afford not to.
With tragic consequences, yeah, if they don't.
So just going further, when you answered the question, you talked about at the management level the SMS being so critical and important. I shared last week also with a tour that I had of one of the major rail facilities along with the president of the company, along with also the president of the union. And actually what I saw at that particular time was a real pervasiveness from right across the structure into the safety management system. So the workers also being very, very much involved in it and being important. Can you just comment on how important it is? So, you know, it's important for management to have this buy-in and to be involved, but from the workers aspect, how important it is that, because the culture, if it doesn't get down to the people at the ground level, really does not adequately suffice, right?
No, the railway employee who is in that high rail truck that is actually running out on routine inspections on the rail line is just as important as the chief safety officer of the corporation in making that happen. And if there is any reluctance, for example, to do whistleblowing on safety problems at the working level, then it will not actually be possible for the chief safety officer to do his job and perform his role. So that openness and that fact that everyone in the corporation understands that safety is part of the corporate culture and not just a management and reporting issue, that is essential. And I think SMS is understood to require that culture be created.
About 40 seconds.
40 seconds. Okay, just a real quick question then on that. As we go forward looking at safety management systems, if you would give us one recommendation as to safety management systems and one of the most important components of that we should be looking at as a committee, what would you say that is in a very brief response?
Well, the effectiveness has to be monitored. We've already had some concerns expressed by the Auditor General, and if there are any concerns about the implementation of safety management systems that come out of any of the TSB reports that we're awaiting, then those should be promptly responded to.
Okay, thank you very much. And Ms. Boutin-Sweet, you have 3 minutes.
Merci beaucoup, messieurs.
Thank you, gentlemen. Since I don't have much time, I'm going to ask Professor Gardner my 2 questions at the same time. You talked about compensation and liability. I would like to talk to you about the human aspect of these things. To quote you, as you said, people before property. And I really liked that. In an article in La Presse Canadienne in August, you spoke of moral obligation. So my first question is, what exactly do you mean by that? And my second question is, you spoke quite frankly about Transport Canada and the fact that they've failed to prevent accidents such as in Lac Mégantic. So my second question is, what should have they done? What are they not doing? What must they do? So in answer to your first question, moral obligation, I will just remind to you what took place 20 years ago here in Canada with the contaminated blood scandal. Now, in that case, the civil liability was never established before federal court of the health department, but there was political pressure, and it was untenable for victims of this contaminated blood to be left to languish before tribunals and courts, and that they would die before it all was resolved. So, national solidarity actually placed enough pressure so that they set up a compensation system. Now there were maximums set, but such problems in such future problems, people will be compensated. Now, I'm not saying that the federal state is responsible for what took place here, but it was a triggering event. People had to realize how the rest of the world had moved forward, and that the railway sector really needed to be renovated in this respect. And renewed in this respect. Now, 47 people lost their lives. As I said, the cost would be fairly low for the state if they were to accept only out of national solidarity to compensate, not completely as you would before the civil courts, but to at least ensure that those people did not have to wait 15 years before being compensated, the beneficiaries, that is to say. So, with respect to the Transportation Bureau, they were the last ones added to the class action suit that was launched in Quebec by victims' representatives. Now, is the Office des Transports responsible for what happened legally? Of course, the Office des Transports cannot be attacked and say that regulation was insufficient. That is a political issue, and luckily, judges do not get involved in such policy issues as to what should be regulated and how. But did they poorly apply existing regulation? That's what's being argued in the context of the amendment that was presented in order to also include them in the class action suit. Now, I don't know whether or not the OTC was, or the CTA rather, failed to apply a given regulation, and that's what was partially responsible for this derailment. Now, of course, I think we could all agree that the current regulations in terms of liability insurance, which did propose a sufficient limit. Now, some of these companies didn't even have $100 million in insurance, and much less than $50 million in one case. If you think about the potential repercussions of such accidents, given the dangerous nature of some of the products being transported, we can all agree, I think, that the insurance coverage they had was quite insufficient. Now, that doesn't mean the state has no responsibility at all.
Getting to the end, I think we got the answer. Miss Young, last 3 minutes. Oh, that's whose name I had. Mr. Komarnicki, last 3 minutes.
With respect to the compensation issue, I gather you were saying that justice delayed is justice denied, and I suspect that you're suggesting a more expedited type of process. What are you suggesting for a tribunal or a process? It has to be quasi-judicial, or a court-like setting because you're dealing with issues of fact and law and so on. So what are you proposing that would expedite the system as opposed to the regular court system?
À partir du moment où
From the moment that a two-level system is set up, for the first level with an automatic compensation or almost automatic, as I said, the carrier would automatically be responsible. But once you set up such a system, once you've introduced, and this does exist in the air transportation regulations, it's just a possibility now. Perhaps it should be made mandatory for the railway sector. The possibility that something will be given to the victim in the months following the accident, so as quickly as possible up to that initial level. And this is what I proposed in the little abstract that I circulated amongst you, the members of the committee. So since there's automatic compensation, then the victim would be compensated quickly, and then one could move on to a trial if there are additional sums deemed to be due.
Another issue, and that is whether or not the damage was caused or contributed by the negligence of the victim. So once you start determining that, and let's say it was mostly the victim, do you not find that you have to go through some kind of a process before there's a payment out, because there obviously wouldn't be any recourse for the funds after. And so once you get into the process, then it becomes a question of finding out what the facts were, what the responsibilities were, and so on. And so is it not then realistic to expect a payout if you have to determine that additional issue?
Si je fais la transposition avec ce qui se fait.
To transpose what's currently being done in the air transportation sector, you can be sure that when a plane crashes upon takeoff or landing, you can be sure that the carrier is not going to go before the courts in order to contest whether or not the victim is at fault. Obviously, the passengers were not at fault. It would be the exact same thing would be true when trains collide or when trains derail. Outside of those theories, yes, I talked to you about the theory of a trespassing incident. Let's say someone is standing on the railways. Well, of course, then the victim could be deemed responsible. Let's take the example of Lac Mégantic. There is absolutely no possibility for the carrier to argue that the victims were at fault. So there is no need to delay or even to contest applying at least the first level of automatic compensation.
Mr. Jeans, we never have enough time, but our time is up for a lot of time for the meeting. So thank you very much for being part of our study on rail safety. Meeting adjourned.